Hey everybody, welcome back to Audrey Approved and Happy New Year. Before we get too far into 2025, I need to do my best books of 2024. I had 12 books that I gave 5 stars to in the last year. 2 of these were rereads, so it very conveniently actually dropped down to a top 10 list. But yeah, I'm gonna go in chronological order. I'm gonna use the timestamps like I do normally, and I will make sure to highlight what my favorite book of the year was, but other than that, they're pretty much unranked. In January, I read The Children of Hurin by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I recently talked about in my wrap-up of books I read with my dad this year in our father-daughter book club. I'll link that if you haven't seen it yet. This was the best book that we read in that club together, and we both gave it 5 stars. This is a darker or more tragic story from Tolkien, and it's very different from The Lord of the Rings, which most people are pretty familiar with. But I think if you want something just as epic in scope and really seeped in lore, so it almost feels a little bit more mythic in tone, then this is a good place or a good book to pick up. I think, again, it's very different, so you shouldn't expect a familiar storyline or familiar characters, but if you want a little bit more of Middle-earth, then, check out Children of Hurin. My second 5-star read of the year was The Forger's Spell, A True Story of Vermeer, Nazis, and the Greatest Art Hoax of the 20th Century by Edward Dolnick. And Edward Dolnick is an author that I've had either really good or I'd say poor luck with in the past. This definitely falls into the former. I did really enjoy this one. And I talked about it in my fraud video, nonfiction books about fraud, under the kind of art category. And this is all about a no-name Dutch painter who uses the chaos around World War II to introduce to the market a series of fake Vermeer paintings. And he does this not for money per se, but because when he signs the paintings with the name Vermeer, his work is lauded as like a masterpiece, and yet when he signs his own paintings with his own name, he's sometimes, ridiculed for it. There's a lot in here, not only about the forger and how he technically did the forgeries, but also the drama between art houses and art critics. There's history of various Dutch artists. There's a discussion about the looting of art, of typically Jewish-owned art by German leadership during World War II. And there's just a lot of discussion on what makes a good piece of art. So I thought this was a really unexpected and very kind of dense and a little bit maybe scattered in a little bit areas, so it kind of jumps back and forth here and there. But overall, I just thought this was a great read and I really, really enjoyed it. A book that I do not see talked about a lot on BookTube or on, Bookstagram at all very much is Poached, Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking by Rachel Love Nuwer. And yeah, this is a really good book. It's a really comprehensive piece of journalism investigating all of the different aspects of wildlife poaching. This was published, I think, in 2016 or 2017, so it's relatively new. And I just really appreciated how, cohesive and whole picture the author made this piece of nonfiction. While mainly focusing on Southeast Asia and Africa, the author covers the actual poachers. She covers people who use these animal products for quote-unquote cures. She follows conservationists, grassroots leaders, legislators, a whole suite of people in order to kind of see the bigger and whole picture of this story. I will note that this was really graphic, so if you don't want to read about very graphic animal abuse, animal torture, then don't pick this up, but I think it was a really important read. It really opened my mind, and it's really stuck with me. I've thought about this one a lot. I think in particular when the author talks about the complexities of changing wildlife poaching, I thought that was a really interesting discussion, because if some of these, quote-unquote cures are part of a cultural belief system, how do you, as an outsider, come in and tell someone that their culture is wrong or misinformed? I think the discussions like this, really added to the actual storytelling. But yeah, if you're interested in the topic or don't know much about it and are willing to listen to a little bit of very graphic animal abuse, then this, I think, is a very important read. Here's where I'm going to go a little bit out of chronological order, because I'm going to talk about 2 books at once, and they are The Tainted Cup and A Drop of Corruption by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is, I forget the name of the actual series. I think it's the Leviathan Wakes, Leviathan something. I'll put it down below. series from Robert Jackson Bennett, and I loved it. I read A Tainted Cup earlier, like towards the beginning of the year, and then I read A Drop of Corruption on Christmas Day this year. Around 80 or 90% of it I read on Christmas Day, and I loved both of them. They're both 5-star reads for me. This series has been talked about quite a bit, and as I've watched, best books of the year videos, I've seen The Tainted Cup pop up a lot. But this is, I say, an equal mix of fantasy and mystery. And I found in particular the world building just really fun. It's set in this very lush, magical world where we follow an investigator and her assistant. And so the stories are told from the point of view of her assistant. And there's this added kind of complexity to the story where different people can have different sort of augmentations that kind of augment their senses. So people can have better smell, better eyesight, better memory, better strength. And those come at a little bit of a cost. But yeah, I thought this was equally fun in its mystery and in its world building. And I think that if you liked The Tainted Cup, you will also really like A Drop of Corruption. It is set up very similar. They both start with a murder. But because you're already familiar with the characters and familiar a little bit with the world, book number 2 can really dive into more background history, so you learn more about our main 2 characters. You learn more about the leviathans that allow for people to make these sort of augmentations, and you learn just a lot more about the world and how, I guess, some of the politics of it. I also thought the mystery in book number 2 was even better than the mystery in book number 1. I could not figure out how it was going, and I don't read a lot of mysteries, so maybe that means my bar is low or it's high, I can't really tell, but I just thought this was absolutely so much fun. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed The Tainted Cup and A Drop of Corruption this year, and I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a new fantasy read. I mentioned that I would talk about what my favorite book of the year was, and that is Challenger, A True Story of Heroism and Disaster on the Edge of Space by Adam Higginbotham, which I don't think people will be very surprised to say that this is my favorite book of the year. It's my first Adam Higginbotham book, and I just really love his investigative reporting. This is a story of the space shuttle disaster of Challenger in 1986, and it covers the history of the space shuttle program at NASA, and it covers all the key players, whether they be astronauts or leadership or engineers or technicians or politicians or family members, up through the events of the disaster and then kind of the repercussions afterwards. I just really enjoyed Higginbotham's very detailed, very humanistic, very emotional, very personal storytelling. And I also really like how he kind of interweaves, these different layers of the overall picture together in a way that actually reminds me quite a bit of Patrick Radden Keefe. I think many times narrative nonfiction and investigative journalism gets compared to Patrick Radden Keefe, and I myself am a huge fan of Patrick Radden Keefe. I think Higginbotham is a very good comparison to it. It's the one case where I agree. These two authors, I think, actually write stories very similarly, and while Patrick Radden Keefe focuses more on crime, Higginbotham is very much focused on like technical and engineering stories. I enjoyed Challenger so much that the day I finished Challenger, I went out and bought a copy of Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster, also by Adam Higginbotham, which is my next 5-star read. And so again, I like it for the same reasons, for the storytelling, but in this case, Higginbotham covers a disaster from the very same year, so also from 1986, but it is the nuclear reactor Chernobyl. In some ways, I think that this is a harder story to report upon because there's more technical background, there's more people involved, I'd say there's more repercussions involved, and I just found that again, it was just a really kind of human and emotional storytelling combined with a lot of, conversations again about technical decision making and technical risk. I think it's safe to say that Higginbotham was my favorite find of the year, and I was just really glad I picked him up this year, and I'm definitely going to be super eager for anything else that he comes out with in the future. Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir is another book that I recently talked about. It's another book that I read with my dad in our book club. And this is the first book in a series, the Locked Tomb series, and I just thought it was so much fun. I read it around the fall time. I think that's the perfect time to read this book. I may have actually mentioned it in my fall recommendations read as well. I think I did talk about it in that video as well. And this follows the main character, Gideon, who is a swordswoman living on this planet, And she is paired with a necromancer, also from her planet, who she really hates. They've been kind of childhood rivals. They dislike each other a lot, and they get sent off to another planet in order to compete in a competition between representatives from a whole bunch of planets inside this, I guess, universe or solar system, or I don't know, wherever this story is set. And there's a strong mystery element, so I guess similar to the Tainted Cup, it's, I would say, equally mystery and world building that I loved so much about it. But this is a lot different in tone. It's very humorous, sometimes a little bit silly, and I just found the main character's humor to really work for me. I have not made it to the second book in the series yet, but it is very high on my list to get to this year. But yeah, I just thought this was a ton of fun, and again, a great autumnal read if you're looking for something next year. Good Material by Dolly Alderton was a surprise, like, banger for me. I had never read Dolly Alderton before, and so I didn't have, I don't know, super high expectations when I picked this up. I listened to it in audiobook, and I would absolutely recommend it in audio. I think the narrator is quite good. This is a piece of contemporary fiction where you follow a main character named Andy, who is a part-time comic, and he has recently been dumped by his, I guess, ex-girlfriend now. And so he's trying to figure out where to live, what to do, how to entertain himself, how to get over his ex-girlfriend. And I think the premise sounds, I don't know, silly, fluffy maybe when I say it like this, but I thought this really nicely balanced humor. Like, I literally laughed out loud while I listened to this audiobook with, I think, some really insightful commentary about what it's like to be a millennial, to be someone who is unsure of yourself, to be someone who's supposed to be an adult but you still feel like a kid. I just thought the author added a lot of, again, really insightful commentary here. I also thought that Andy as a character was kind of pathetic and frustrating and annoying at times, but also a little bit endearing, and he felt, I think, very real. Like, Andy could be somebody that I met in real life. And so, yeah, again, it's just a really pleasant surprise. I haven't picked up anything else from Dolly Alderton, but if you have recommendations, let me know, because I definitely want to check out more of her stuff in 2025. And then my last 5-star read of the year, it slid in just like a few days before the new year, is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right by Arlie Russell Hochschild. I first came across Strangers in Their Own Land because I saw the author's Nuwer release in a local bookstore, and I figured, hey, maybe I should read the backlist first. And I had seen a review somewhere that said that Strangers in Their Own Land was the book to read if you wanted to understand why Trump won the 2016 election. So Strangers in Their Own Land was published in 2016. Well, it's relevant now. And so after the election this year, I decided that, hey, I was going to pick up Strangers in Their Own Land. Now, I think when talking about political books, I think it's important to say what my bias is. So I am a liberal woman that has lived and grown up on the West Coast, typically in urban areas. And so I feel like this book is written for somebody like me because the author is local. She's a UC Berkeley professor of sociology, and she kind of sets off to Louisiana, to a certain area in Louisiana that has a high level of environmental pollution, to answer what she calls the Great Paradox, which is, why do voters in this area, Tea Party voters in particular, why do they vote for political stances that want to deregulate environmental protection when they themselves live in some of the most polluted environmental areas in the United States? So, these people have been kicked out of their homes, they've gotten cancer, and yet they don't want EPA regulation. So she goes off to this area to try and understand, why is it these people vote the way they do? I think this kind of evolves from there. So she ends up talking about a lot more than environmental protection. And in particular, she's added in like a really long afterword after Trump won the actual 2016 election. And in particular, there's one analogy that the author makes partway through the book that she references time and time again to understand why these people that she's interviewing, these Tea Party voters, vote the way they do. And I do think that it is the first time that I have read something like that and been like, oh, I could see how someone could think that way. Like, I still disagree with some of it, but I can understand why someone might feel that way based on their experiences. And so that is huge. For that reason alone, it gets 5 stars, right? Because it's changed the way that I kind of think about some of these decisions and some of these events. I also think that the author really manages to very much humanize all of the people that she talks to. And I think that's, again, really necessary when you talk about politics, to bridge kind of that emotional divide. So yeah, I feel like I learned a ton. I think this would make a great discussion. I actually wish that we had read this book in the book club I have with my dad. So I'm gonna try and get him to read this and then maybe read the follow-up, the Nuwer book, together next year. But yeah, I think if you are a similar kind of political stance as me, and you also have big question marks on how certain political decisions have been made, especially in the last month or two, then I think this might be a place to start to understand. That wraps up my 2024 top 10 list. It is, I think, an equal split of fiction and nonfiction, which is, I think, decently reflective of how I read. I felt the year was decent, maybe not the best in terms of how many books I loved versus liked versus disliked. I made not as much progress on the Read the World project as I wished, but I do owe you guys a few wrap-ups. But I did read some very good nonfiction. I think the fiction books I read in 2023 were a lot stronger than the ones I read this year, but overall, I can't really complain. Thanks again for being here and watching. I do really appreciate everybody who chimes in and who, spends a few minutes to chat with me or to watch what I say about certain books. But yeah, I hope that I have encouraged you to read something good. I hope you had a really good reading year, and I hope 2025 is even better. Yeah, please take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.